Welcome to the Barakat Trust podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Barakat Trust, where we invite scholars, practitioners, and experts to discuss the most important ideas that concern the cultural and artistic heritage of the Islamic world. I'm Thomas Adkins, Communications Coordinator at the Barakat Trust, and in our episode today, I'm joined by Fuchsia Hart, curator, writer, and speaker, with a focus on the arts of Islamic cultures, specifically the Persianate world. It's great to have you on the podcast today, Fuchsia.
Great to be here.
Today we're taking a very different journey further north, pivoting to Uzbekistan, where late last year Fuchsia accompanied the Barakat Trust on one of our trips, where she was one of the expert scholars who guided our guests around some of the sites that we visited there. And today we're hoping to bring some aspects of that trip to life in a podcast, because it fits very well with the theme of the podcast this year, peripheries, which we've been working on since the beginning of 2026. Fuchsia has been the Sarikhani Curator for the Iranian Collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London since 2022. In 2025, Fuchsia completed her PhD in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford, with a thesis exploring Fath Ali Shah Qajar's patronage of the major shrines in Iran and Iraq. Anyway, so let's turn to Fuchsia and to Uzbekistan. Maybe we can begin with a sort of perplexing question about Uzbekistan that really we need an entire series or maybe multiple series of podcasts to answer, which is, how did the desert and steppe of Central Asia come to be home to some of the richest Persianate heritage in the Islamic world, a whole 1,500 kilometers away from Persia or Iran?
Thank you, Thomas, for getting us started. Yes, I think it's useful maybe to start with the location of Uzbekistan, because it's really nestled in the heart of the region that we now call Central Asia. And obviously the country of Uzbekistan itself is a relatively modern one, a relatively recent creation, a young republic. But it's home to a number of very ancient sites, which are largely clustered around oases that sort of run along what is now the country, fed by two major rivers, which have supported a number of great cities and civilizations, which we're going to cover today, ranging from what we now see as the archaeological site of Afrasiab in Samarkand, which of course Samarkand would then grow into the great Timurid capital of the 14th century. And then also, of course, more recent cities such as Tashkent.
To link to the theme, what we would consider the center of the Persianate world. 1,500 kilometers away in the north is Uzbekistan and the valley and the oases. How did it spread this far?
Well, I think it's worth starting even just pointing out that before the Islamic period, of course, I'm thinking here of the Silk Roads, which is a much contested term. But even though we might think of Uzbekistan as being far from places that might be considered a center, I'm sure this is something that we can also unpack a bit. It has been connected to places such as Korea, the now modern places of Korea, China, the rest of Central Asia, and then through into Western Asia by trade routes. And of course, it depends what period you're looking at, but those trade routes were supported by sort of caravanserais and other trading posts, stopping posts along the way. I mean, something I might emphasize while we're sort of touching on this, the Silk Roads narrative, is that Central Asia and Uzbekistan in particular, as the one country within Central Asia that does have these great cities and monuments and that are representative of these civilizations, that these places have often been characterized as crossroads and stopping points. But I actually, I quite like the small tweak to this that's made by Frederick Starr in his book Lost Enlightenment, that he characterizes, he talks about rather less than a a crossroads of culture than a culture of crossroads. That this is something which has actually really shaped what we now think of as Uzbekistan and its history and its material culture as well. That it has been so connected to lots of places, including what we now think of as Iran.
Yeah, I mean, this culture of crossroads is actually, thanks for mentioning it, because it's quite a useful one, thinking about previous episodes, especially Ethiopia, realizing that trade has played such a big role in the spread of material culture, language, building. It is the main conduit, I guess, not just funding, but also traveling with these merchants, these sort of ideas. Within Uzbekistan itself, and maybe you could refer to the trip last year, how far away the cities that we're going to talk about today, Tashkent, Samarkand, and Bukhara?
So maybe it's useful to frame it a little bit around the way that we traveled on the trip, which was high speed train. So Tashkent is in, as I say, sort of Uzbekistan is right in the middle of Central Asia. It's actually a doubly landlocked country, so it's very far away from the sea. I mean, obviously you have the Caspian on the border of Kazakhstan, but so Tashkent is in the northeast of the country, very near the border with Kazakhstan. And then from there on the tour, we traveled to Samarkand, which is about a 2-hour train journey. So, but that is with the high speed train, and that's to the southwest of Tashkent, more centrally in the country. And from there, Bukhara again is further west, a little bit further, 2.5 hours on the train. And both Samarkand and Bukhara are in what is sort of central Uzbekistan, because the far west of Uzbekistan, which is a region which is sort of dominated by a region called Karakalpakstan, which is there's a lot of desert there, basically.
Okay. So the three big cities, are they the three largest cities as well, I imagine?
Yes, yeah.
So I find it interesting because we're going back in time a bit, talking about Uzbekistan as a Persianate part of the world, a Persianate region, these cities as Persianate cities. But maybe an overwhelming impression that people have of Uzbekistan, and more broadly the countries of Central Asia today, or is an impression of a sort of a post-Soviet, a very Russian-influenced region.
Yes.
And I think this links into maybe why we don't know so much about Uzbekistan as a Persianate center. What would you add to that and your experience as well as of working on the Persianate culture of the pre-modern world?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and that sort of brings us on to this idea of a center and a periphery in a way within our studies of Islamic art, because I want to emphasize that this is totally your view of what's central and what's peripheral is obviously totally subjective. It's from whichever viewpoint you're looking at, but because and of course, there are many. Uzbekistan is contained in objects from there are displayed in many galleries of Islamic art. It's included in many objects, mainly, let's say, Timurids, so of the 14th or 15th century, included in surveys of Islamic art. But it certainly hasn't had as much focus as, let's say, the Central Arab lands, Turkey, Iran, let's say.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is if we're, coming sort of from my position of having studied in the tradition of Islamic art as formed in Western Europe and North America, Uzbekistan, of course, has been the realm of Russian scholars traditionally, historically. So Uzbekistan, of course, was colonized by the Russian Empire in the 19th century and then went on to become part of the Soviet Union. So even in the 19th century, when, of course, we have, if I'm kind of thinking with my V&A hat on, when the museum is collecting in the 19th century, we do have objects from Iran that we acquired in the 19th century, but it's not the same picture as it was for Iran, for example, that the museum had an agent in Iran who was working on the Indo-European telegraph. because obviously Iran wasn't part of the British Empire, but it very much fell under the Brits
sphere of influence, maybe, or
exactly, to fall under that sphere of influence, being so closely linked to India. But it's quite a different story for Uzbekistan, being under Russian control. Even in the 19th century, it was harder for Brits to travel there, and even in the, of course, in the 20th century that continued. And actually, the real sort of watershed moment recently was 2019, when Uzbekistan changed its visa rules. And
that recently.
In 2019, travel became visa-free for 30 days, I think. So
wow.
It's now much easier. And this is why tourism is really booming there now. People are really able to travel there more easily. So yes, one aspect of it is the actual physical travel aspect of being able to go there. Another aspect, I would say, which this is sort of from a personal, I can speak from a personal point of view, that obviously my education and my research has really focused on Iran, and it's been only in the past couple of years that I've really come to focus a little bit more on Uzbekistan. So for us, I think in the canon of Islamic literature as shaped in Western Europe, it could be seen as being slightly peripheral. And indeed, when you do study objects from Uzbekistan, they are often, or even early Persian literature, say, that's being written under the Samarkand dynasty of the 9th and 10th century, it's often still, under the umbrella of Iranian studies, or
yes.
Persian miniature painting. I'm doing scare quotes from Bukhara. It's all sort of, it's often been put under a very different umbrella rather than being presented as the arts of Uzbekistan per se.
Dragged into the sphere, or the Iranian or Persian sphere, rather than its own. I mean, Russian, I suppose that's another language to add to the list of ones to learn.
I'm trying.
So I think if we just roll it back to the trip slightly, Tashkent, where you began, we've talked about so far very briefly, we've mentioned a lot of different things that would fall under the category of Islamic art, whether it's buildings or Persian miniatures you've just mentioned. I think one thing that I liked about the trip, or at least the photos I saw of it, was you weren't just visiting buildings, you were also visiting a lot of crafts. Maybe you could tell me about one of the places or one of the people that you met in Tashkent, and how that links into this story.
Thank you. Yeah, so we started in Tashkent, which, of course, as I say, it's an ancient city, but it became the capital of the Turkestan region of the Russian Empire in the 1860s. And then it grew into a large Soviet city. It had a major earthquake in 1966, and the sort of new city was built after that. So there's sort of an old city and a new city in Tashkent. And it's a great place to see if you're into Soviet modernist architecture, as well as some more historic Islamic monuments as well. So we did spend some time looking at architecture. But yes, one of the moments here that I wanted to highlight was on that we had a very first day when people were arriving at slightly different times, and so not everybody got to go on this visit, which is in a way why I wanted to highlight it, to see the maker Medina Kasimbayeva, who is really one of the foremost artist makers continuing the Suzani tradition in Uzbekistan. So Suzani is traditional needlework, embroidery. It comes from the Persian word for needle, and it's quite traditionally, it has sort of it has its roots in the sort of the Tajik culture. That's not to say it's not practiced by we haven't really touched on this, but of course there are many different peoples living in what is now Uzbekistan, including Uzbeks, but Tajiks as well. So the Suzani tradition has historically been sort of associated with the Tajik people. And the Suzani tradition is characterized by a few stitches, but maybe the most well-known is the chain stitch. And women would make these objects for their trousseau, for their wedding box to take to their new home with them. So I mean, women and girls really would make them, and they'd include sort of soft furnishings for the home, you know, hangings for the wall and for doors, and bedspreads, and this is a really, you know, it's not unique to Uzbekistan, because also there are peoples in Tajikistan and Afghanistan that also make Suzanis and have made and continue to make. But Medina Kasimbayeva has really, she's one of these makers who has really taken an old craft and an old skill and revitalized it for the 20th and 21st century market, really.
So was it sort of, I don't want to say going extinct, but sort of, was it struggling? Or has it had a period where it has struggled?
Yes, I mean, because traditionally, yes, women don't make these anymore at home, but they wouldn't have been pieces that there wasn't really a market for them in the past.
Yeah.
But, you know, because they were just, a family would make them for themselves and then they would stay with the family. But she has, you know, taken the motifs and the stitches, and rather than, you know, they do make traditional Suzani sort of hangings, but also using the same techniques to make clothes, shoes, bags, and the work is really high quality. And she's actually set up quite an amazing business which supports a lot of women all across the country. She sort of outsources the embroidery to women across the country. And I'm interested in this because at the V&A we do have quite a large collection of Suzanis, many of which were acquired in the 19th century, which is quite important, being able to, you know, really date them quite solidly to sort of pre the date that we acquired it in, like the 1890s or whenever. And at the V&A, it's a bit of a case in point of what we were just discussing, that we've had them in the collection. We have around 35, but as far as I can tell, none of them have ever been displayed.
Oh, wow.
Because, you know, most of the textiles that we display in the Jamil Gallery are, you know, they're Safavid, they're Ottoman, and there isn't necessarily sort of the place for that narrative of maybe a 19th century Suzani. And they haven't even been very well photographed. So this is something I'm trying to remedy, to give them a little bit more attention and to eventually get around to cataloguing them a little bit better. And we actually hope that we will put one on display soon. So watch this space on that one. But they have strong regional traditions. So different patterns and motifs are associated with different regions. So they can be quite easily sort of identified what tradition they've come from.
Yeah, I was going to ask, where can we see them without going to Uzbekistan? But I suppose you've answered the question for now.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say they are increasingly popular in sort of interior design circles.
Right, okay.
The Suzani technique has become very sort of fashionable. It is very rare. I saw one on display at the Royal Collection in Glasgow. That was maybe a couple of years ago. I don't know if it's still on display. Yes, you don't see that. I mean, there are amazing displays of them in Uzbekistan, but you don't see them in your kind of like Islamic art gallery.
Yes. So either it's a West London interior design shop or Uzbekistan. So yeah, thanks for introducing us to Tashkent. After Tashkent, you then, I mean, we're moving pretty quickly. Unfortunately, we can't cover everything in this very rich collection of cities. You went off to Samarkand.
Yeah, so yes, we got on the train to Samarkand, and as I said with Tashkent, it's similar to Tashkent in that it is a city which has you know, a long history to it, but it continues as a modern city today as well. But when we arrived in Samarkand, we went straight to Afrasiyab, which is the site of the pre-Mongol site of Samarkand. So, which is now really mainly an archaeological site. It's an archaeological site, and it's accompanied by a museum. So we immediately went there to sort of situate ourselves. And even from the mound at Afrasiab of the archaeological site, you can see the new city of Samarkand as well.
And sorry, just for context, Afrasiab is from, you said pre-Mongol. When roughly? Which centuries are you talking about?
So actually, it's it's famous for, it's often mentioned in connection with Alexander the Great. It was, of course, sacked by him. The period of history that we really focused on when we were there is the very late Sogdian period. So this is really the 7th century. So immediately pre-Islamic period.
Yeah.
So the Sogdians were a sort of confederation of tribes living and trading, indeed, across the region, an Iranian people. And they, what they're best known for at Afrasiab are the really wonderful murals that were discovered on the archaeological site in the 1960s, 1965, I think, which are now on display in the Afrasiab Museum. And some people might have seen one of them, which was really remarkable. They're huge, huge murals, and remarkably, one of them was brought to London on loan for the Silk Road exhibition at the British Museum. Wow. So yes, at Afrasiab, we really focused on the early history of Samarkand, both thinking about that immediate pre-Islamic moment with the Sogdians, and then the early Islamic period, and particularly thinking about the ceramic production actually at Afrasiab, which there was extensive evidence of ceramics excavated, and ceramic firing kilns were also discovered. And this is the type of ceramic which is the black on white wares, often associated with the Sarmanid period of the sort of 10th century.
Okay. So
you really do get very deep layers of history at Afrasiab, and of course that's one part of Samarkand's history, because then when you move away from Afrasiab and you go into what is now the center of Samarkand, you've got the really monumental Timurid buildings of the 14th and early 15th century. And then continuing, perhaps the highlight of Samarkand is the Registan, the complex of 3 madrasas, which were built across a number of centuries, taking us right from Ulugh Beg in the 15th century through to the 17th century. So yeah, I think that's the thing that strikes me most about Samarkand.
And when you're there in Samarkand in 1 or 2 or 3 days, and you visit Afrasiab, and then you come into what you said is now the center, can you feel that the relatively newer Islamic architecture has drawn on to some extent the pre-Islamic architecture of Afrasiab, or whether it's the ceramics or other aspects of the material culture?
That's a good question. I think what's remarkable in Samarkand is that you can, and indeed across Uzbekistan, is that you can trace the development of certain features. I wouldn't necessarily argue that in Samarkand you can trace the development directly sort of from the pre-Islamic period, but within Samarkand itself, you also have the site of Shahizende, which is the necropolis, the remnants of it is actually, when you visit it, you don't necessarily feel like you're connected to Afrasiab, but it is the sort of the cemetery on the edge of the site of Afrasiab, which also has pre-Timurid monuments. So sort of continuing the ceramic theme, when you go to Shahizende, there's a whole collection of mausolea still existing there and tiled. And you can really see the development of particularly architectural ceramics from really sort of the 14th century right through, and then you can go to the Timurid monuments of Bibi Khanum and the mosque built by Timur in the beginning of the 15th century, and then onto his mausoleum, the Gora Amir, and then, as I say, on to the 16th and 17th centuries in Registan. Something that you really can trace is the development from like cut tile mosaic work through the sort of what has been known as the cuerda seca technique, which is more sort of properly known as sort of the haftarang technique, the inglaze technique, and then also to overglaze techniques like lajvardina, which involve gilding and other overglaze techniques. So you can really that's quite exciting if you're if you're into the development of ceramics. You can take quite a journey there.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you've just spun me through Samarkand. The amount of places and techniques that you just mentioned is quite bewildering, really. I mean, you really do need to visit to put all of these in context.
I hope people can look some of these if they haven't visited yet. I mean, obviously go and visit, but maybe you can also look some of these up to get an idea.
Well, moving on to the final city on the trip, and it's sort of I guess a more of a contemporary turn. I wanted to ask you about the Bukhara Biennial that took place, I believe, at the same time you were there as well. Correct?
Yeah, it was fantastic to coincide with the biennial. So yeah, from Samarkand, we took our train on to Bukhara, and the biennial was really a highlight that you couldn't miss because it sort of inhabited quite a lot of the old city of Bukhara, which is a really wonderful place to visit because it's very much, I'd say it's sort of the easiest, it's the most walkable, except maybe for the old town of Khiva. It's really lovely to just wander around Bukhara's old city, and the biennial was taking place in a number of sites which had been renovated for the events, a caravanserai and a madrasa, and then there were also installations dotted outside around the old city as well. So and it was totally free. You didn't need a ticket, so you really could just sort of enter the city, and it was really full of art, basically, which was really fun. And it was the first time they'd done this, so it was quite exciting to see the first edition of it. And I think we really enjoyed it. It was pretty successful. Something I really enjoyed was the fact that, of course, the artists that were represented there were really drawn from, many from Uzbekistan, many from across Central Asia, but then many from other parts of the world as well. And actually, I should explain, the model was that the international artist, although sometimes they were an Uzbek artist, would be paired with local Uzbek makers.
Okay, I
to
see.
make the work. So it really helped to promote the work of local artists and makers as well, and give them that chance to work with an international artist, perhaps with a higher profile. But we also, obviously, we did spend quite a bit of time with the biennial, but we also there are a lot of historic sites to see as well, including the Salmanid Mausoleum, which is a real highlight as well. But we can maybe talk about some others as well.
Yeah, well, all I was going to say about the biennial was it really sounds like what you said at the beginning, almost a part of the country's efforts to put itself on the map more with opening up visas to certain countries in 2019, and now the biennial, which we see in a lot of places around the world as a model that is promoting the local heritage and crafts and traditions of the city. So good to see, good that you enjoyed, and
completely.
There'll be another one, 2 years.
I mean, yes, there will be. I think completely. It's no coincidence that that's also why our visit happened when it did. I mean, there's so much more interest now in Uzbekistan, and there is so much more happening, and new museums are opening, and they really are trying to diversify their economy and attract a cultural audience by promoting their arts and indeed the crafts such as Medina Kasimbayeva, who I mentioned in Tashkent.
Well, it certainly makes me want to go and visit at some point. There was one thing that we were chatting about before that you said you didn't have a chance to visit on the trip as such, which was a mausoleum. Do you mind
Mm,
just telling us briefly about that and
yeah.
why you thought it was worth mentioning,
Yeah,
given
so
it
another
didn't?
another mausoleum. This time, this is the mausoleum of Buyan Qoli Khan, who was a local ruler in Bukhara. He died in 1358. So here we are, and it's another example of great pre-Timurid architectural ceramics. I'm quite interested in this. It wasn't one that we visited with the Barakat group, unfortunately, but it's a little bit off the beaten track.
Right.
It's sort of originally it was outside Bukhara, but now it's actually in the sort of suburbs of Bukhara, surrounded
As
by
it's grown.
surrounded by apartment buildings. But it's of interest to me with my V&A hat on, because those architectural ceramics, the tiles from Buyan Qoli Khan's mausoleum, are there's a large number of them, and now in the V&A. And actually, if you come to visit the Jamil Gallery for the Islamic Middle East, our sort of biggest display of objects from Uzbekistan are the tiles from Buyan Qoli Khan's mausoleum. They're not only in the V&A, there's also quite a large collection in Hamburg, but I think we have the largest amount. And recently, that's something that I've actually also been doing a little bit of research on, and trying to understand how they came from the building, which does still stand, does still have some of the tile work in situ. And I've been researching the collector of these tiles, W.J. Myers, who was a British military man, but who spent a lot of his time traveling, initially in Egypt, and he collected, he had a large collection of Egyptian material, which is now housed at Eton, which is his school.
Right.
But he was actually the sort of, I wanted to mention him because he's sort of the exception to the rule of Brits not being able to go to what was then the Russian Empire, because he did go in 1897. But as I've seen from archival material in the V&A and from his diaries, it took him quite a lot of paperwork to get there, to prove that he was not a British spy. So he goes in 1897 and he buys a lot of these tiles in Bukhara. And then he comes back and gives them to quite a few to the V&A in 1898, but then he dies in the Boer War the next year in 1899, and then we receive more of them after his death in 1900. So I've been doing a little bit of research on those roots, because it's not such a clear-cut story about how we formed our collections from Uzbekistan. It's not, as I mentioned earlier, we had an agent in Iran. There are other stories of how we bought at international exhibitions, for example. But with Uzbekistan, it's a little bit more patchy. And for example, some of those 19th century Suzanis that we have were even bought in Lahore, when someone was collecting for the museum in what is now India and Pakistan. So it's been really interesting to sort of look at some of those roots of material, including these tiles from Buyan Qoli Khan, from Uzbekistan to the museum in London.
Wow. Well, I have one final question, but at first, thank you for drawing. I mean, we came in with a blank canvas, and thank you for drawing such a beautiful portrait of Uzbekistan and the places to visit. With, to use your words, your V&A hat on, and linking into the theme peripheries. In your role at the V&A as maybe a more forwards-facing role in the grand scheme of the field of Islamic art and architecture and heritage, how do you think you have a role or influence in how we as an audience view and understand the periphery or the center or whatever model we would like to work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's, I think this series is great for focusing on those areas which really have been marginalized in in the field of Islamic art. But I think we do, I think we have to a certain extent moved away from the center and periphery model, at least from this idea of kind of the creative spark happening at the center and then kind of like
trickle down
to the periphery. And I think that actually Uzbekistan is a great place to study that. And even for me, having Iran as kind of like my center of what I've studied, going to Uzbekistan and trying to understand it on its own terms, I think is what we really need to try to do. And that whether that's through the texts that we read, or through the certain traditions which we do display, such as Suzani, which, is something which is quite distinctive from that region. I think it is important that we do highlight the ways in which these regions, and I mean, particularly Uzbekistan, we don't have enough time to cover all of this, but while it might be thought of as marginal to a certain extent in our field, it really has been a center of literary production, of scholarly practice, in terms of the intellectuals and the historians and the scientists that actually went there or came from there and went to Central Islamic lands. So, I mean, and that's a sort of exchange that we even touched on at the beginning. I think it's really important to have that whole picture, and I'm also really excited to be. It's something that we do at the V&A quite a lot now, but to be working with and in touch with a number of young Uzbek artists as well, which is something that also came out of the biennial, because it's really important to see how they can engage with our collections from Uzbekistan and how they would interpret them or respond to them as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you for taking the time to speak. And I don't know if you have any plans to return soon to Uzbekistan.
Hope so. Nothing solid, but I'll be back there before long, definitely.
Okay. Well, thank you, Fuchsia, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Barakat Trust podcast.